Tuesday, April 13th. We are very grateful for St. Stephen's, North Myrtle Beach, and Father Wilmot Merchant and Father Rob Donahue for offering morning prayer this morning for us. I'd like to introduce to you all the chairs of the Transition Committee. Once again, this is Pat Newman and Rick Stahl, and Pat and Rick will be helping guide us through the events of today. So Rick and Pat, take it away.
Thank you, Caleb. Good morning again to everyone. And thank you for coming in this morning and tuning in. I'd like to also thank all of our candidates and participants that were here yesterday for the first day of our candidate conversations. And I want to give a special shout out to our technology team. They are the folks that are running this behind the scenes and have done an outstanding job. That's Andrea McKella, Lauren Kynard, Molly Hamilton, and Rob Donahue. My name is Pat Newman. I am one of the co-chairs of the Transition Committee. I am from the Episcopal Church on Edisto, and I have been a member of the Diocese of South Carolina for 15 years. With me today is my co-chair, Rick Stahl.
Thank you, Pat. I am Rick Stahl, the other co-chair of the Transition Committee. I'm from Church of the Messiah in Myrtle Beach, and I've been a member of our diocese for 26 years. It's my honor this morning to be able to introduce our candidates, and so welcome to them. And I'm not creative today, so I'm going in alphabetical order by surname. First is the Reverend Jeffrey St. John Hoare, who is rector of St. Albans Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. Good morning, Jeffrey.
Morning.
Next is the Reverend Kevin Allen Johnson, rector of St. Albans Episcopal Church in Arlington, Texas.
Morning.
Good morning. We also have the Reverend Canon Terrence Alexander Lee, rector of St. Philip's Episcopal Church, New York City. Good morning, Terrence.
Morning. Good morning.
The Venerable Calhoun Walpole, who is our Archdeacon in the Diocese of South Carolina and also Vicar and Subdean of Grace Church Cathedral in Charleston. Good morning, Callie.
Good morning.
And finally, the Reverend Canon Ruth Woodliff Stanley, Canon for Strategic Change for the Diocese of Northwestern Pennsylvania and Western New York, and also the Senior Vice President for Strategic Change for the Episcopal Church Building Fund. Good morning, Ruth.
Good morning.
Thank you to each of you. We're excited to have another day of talking with you. And for participants tuning in, be reminded that the diocesan website does have a special section of materials and information to help us all get to know the candidates better. That information will be available in the Zoom chat room. Pat and I are going to walk you through some of the logistics for the day. Pat?
We will begin with a 2-hour panel discussion led by moderators who have been chosen by the Transition Committee. We will be taking a 10-minute break around 11 a.m. and then coming back for the remainder of the panel discussion. We'll wrap up the panel discussion and have a short break around noontime, followed by noonday prayer at 12:15. We'll then have an extended afternoon break. Evening prayer will be at 5 p.m. Breakouts after evening prayer for roughly 2.5 hours. Participants are not expected to attend absolutely everything each day, although you're welcome to do so. Morning panel discussions are being recorded and live streamed via the diocesan YouTube page. The recordings will be available on the Bishop Search website as soon as we can post them. The afternoon sessions will not be recorded because they are designed to be more informal. We'll give further instructions about the afternoon session when we get there. During the short break times, please feel free to switch off your video feed. Our diocesan staff is on hand running the technical side of things. So if anyone out there has technical issues, please be in touch with them.
Thank you, Pat. Here's a little detail about the morning panel discussions. 2 hours in duration. The questions were chosen by the transition committee from the questions submitted from all of you all out there in the diocese. Each candidate will have 3 to 5 minutes to answer the question, and they'll be taking turns doing that. The order for the rotation of candidates is completely random. At this point, I'm pleased to introduce our moderators for the morning. The Reverend Chris Huff is rector of St. George's in Somerville, and Larry Watt is from Christ Church in Denmark. Good morning to you two.
Morning.
So here we go. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Pat. Good morning. Welcome to our candidates, all of you. Glad to see you here again, and still it looks as though you're all in one piece. Looks as though you're rested. As they said, I am Chris Huff. I'm the rector of St. George's in Somerville. And with me today is Larry Watt from Christ Church in Denmark. So just a reminder that the questions that we're going to be asking our candidates have been chosen from those that were submitted from all around the diocese, from the clergy and laity. And each candidate will have 3 to 5 minutes to answer the question in turn, and then we will give you an indication when your time is almost up. And then we will give you a final indication. And we tested out this morning to make sure that our indicators are within the field of sight so that you'll be able to see them. And so, although she was introduced last this morning, our first one to answer a question will be Ruth. Ruth, are you prepared?
I am, thank you.
All right, here we go. This first question touches on the theme of shared ministry of laity and clergy. Over the last 9 years, without a full-time bishop overseeing the diocese, lay leaders of dispossessed congregations have commendably and heroically stepped up to create new missional works. What is your advice to clergy who want to join those congregations in a role of shared leadership? And what is your vision and understanding of a proper balance of lay and clergy leadership in congregations?
Thank you. I have been listening and learning so much about the lay ministries across the diocese, and I have been really quite moved by how much you all as laity have had to carry. You know, you don't expect to have to step into the depth of work when you come to church that I know you've had, and the burden of not just coming to church as a place of sustenance and respite and renewal, but coming to church with your sleeves rolled up and having to shoulder really the weight of a massive lawsuit, and having to live with the pain of the separation from people that you love, who are have been across the aisle and the pews, who've been around your dinner table. So I'm really mindful of that, and I'm really impressed by the work that you've done. I also know that the clergy have been shouldering that that burden as well. So, you know, I would feel humbled to be invited to give advice. I think the first thing I would want to do would be to really hear how that has been working particularly between clergy and laity, because you've been on the ground living this reality for some time. I do know that you've had to live into what we're all learning in the Episcopal Church regarding the roles of all the baptized and the roles of those of us who are in holy orders. And that is that the old model of father knows best or mother knows best is a thing of the past. It comes out of a different era, and it doesn't serve us well now. Really, in our liturgical reform, in our theological reform of the last several decades, we've come to much more deeply embrace the ministry of the baptized. And so I would really want to invite us to continue to lean into what you've been leaning into by necessity in the last number of years, and to build on the strengths that has given you. And I've been fortunate to be in diocese where models of ministry that really center the leadership of the laity, what are sometimes called total ministry models, with lay pastoral leaders, with the laity exercising a much more responsibility for the liturgical and pastoral ministries of the church, are thriving. So I would want, as your bishop, to really resource us to make use of those models, so that places that might be struggling with leadership and with resources can lean into those new models. And they really involve both strengthening the capacity and the freedom for laity to lead, and also partnering with one another in perhaps some new ways. I feel like there was a last part of that question, Chris. Could you repeat the very last part? I want to make sure I don't miss it.
Sure, happy to. What is your vision and understanding of a proper balance of lay and clergy leadership in a congregation?
Thank you. You know, the clergy, we have each of us have I think particular roles, and I wouldn't want to see those blurred or diminished, because I think we're at our best when each distinct role is thriving, right? So the deacons, who interpret the needs of the church to the world and really stand in the doorway between the church and the world, and call us out and bring those needs in. I have had a lot of experience being part of an effort to strengthen the role of deacons, and I would continue to do that. I think the priests, as the ones who bear the sacramental presence, who really tend to the life of the saints and equip the saints in the local setting, is vitally important. And the teaching role, the pastoral role, as well as the sacramental role. We are a people that experiences the gospel through our five senses, and the priests really help do that. So I really believe that the bishop has to support the collegium, both of the deacons and the priests, in material ways to make that work possible. And then the ministry that we all share is rooted, of course, in the ministry of the baptized. And I think I would want to see us really looking at ways to let all of the laity in the diocese have a bit of rest, catch your breath a bit, and make sure that you are being nourished and fed and renewed and able to find your own spiritual gifts. Sometimes we have members who sit idle in the pew who are eager to be called into play. So while you've had to bear the burden of too much responsibility for some leaders, I suspect there are others who are eager to do some things that they haven't. And so I would want to really focus on discovery of spiritual gifts. Where is your deepest joy in serving the Lord and in serving in the greater body of the church, so that we share the gospel in our local context most effectively? So I think when all of our orders are thriving and doing what we're called to do in our distinct ministries, there's a complementary way in which that functions to really make the gospel visible in local communities. So that's really my vision of how that balance should work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, next to answer this question is Kevin. And so let me repeat the question for you, Kevin. Over the last 9 years, without a full-time bishop overseeing the diocese, lay leaders of dispossessed congregations have commendably and heroically stepped up to create new missional works. What is your advice to clergy who want to join those congregations in a role of shared leadership? And what is your vision and understanding of a proper balance of lay and clergy leadership in a congregation?
Well, good morning. Thanks. So there's a reason Ruth and I are friends is because we think a lot alike. Almost 6 years ago, I came to the Diocese of Fort Worth as a choice and became rector of a dispossessed congregation. Some folks who had been kicked out of their building for being too spiritually generous. And what I discovered was a lay leadership that had not previously been allowed to practice their vocations. Yet during because of the schism and the dispossession, there was a void, and they stepped up and discovered their own vocations, practiced those vocations, and are amazingly competent and wonderful and faithful and generous and spiritual people. So when I arrived, a mentor of mine, the priest that presented me for confirmation in this diocese, said to me, if you will just let them do their work, you won't have to work nearly as hard. And he was right. And he said it kind of tongue in cheek, but the real lesson there was, Episcopal churches are full of competent, capable, faithful folks. And sometimes, and I've been guilty of this in the past, I tend to over function in areas that are best done by those competent, capable, spiritual folks. And the loss in that is that those folks don't then get to practice their God-given vocations as fully as they could. And so what I've learned, being a priest, a rector of a parish that's in that context, a dispossessed parish, is to step back and to encourage and cheerlead and love and thank the lay folks who are amazingly wonderful and competent. And I've seen that across the whole diocese. So not just in my parish, but also in parishes that weren't dispossessed. The laity stepped up and filled so many of those leadership voids. And frankly, the diocese functions much better now than it did before. So there's that. I agree with Ruth that culturally, societally, spiritually, we are out beyond the era of Father Knows Best. One of the reasons I'm actually an Episcopalian, I grew up and went to Catholic schools, was in Catholic world, moved to the Episcopal world. One of the reasons I moved was because as a layperson, I thought it was important to be able to ask questions, and because I saw that as a marker of faith and a deepening of faith, and to share in the ministry, and so I have no desire to go back to the historic previous models of leadership in the church. Frankly, I think the church is a much more healthy place than it used to be. And the other reason I joined the Episcopal Church is because of the tradition of shared leadership, shared authority, shared responsibility. It's not just about me, the guy with the collar on. It's about all of us together, walking together into the future. In regards to the vision and understanding the balance, again, I think that ties back to the vocational piece. We are all called to particular vocations, and helping each of us understand what that vocation is. And when we're each practicing our particular vocations, then that is what enables the system to function as healthy as it can. So I practice my vocation as a priest, the sacramental aspect of it. Vocational deacons practice their vocation as bringing the world to the church and the church to the world, and lay people practice their various vocations. And we allow each other and support each other to do that work. So thank you.
Thank you, Cabot. Just a little note in before we move on to the next question, to the next responder candidate. Our co-moderator this morning, Larry Watt, is in and out on his internet connection, so I'm also doing the timekeeping, and I may actually roll into the next question. It just all depends. So, but to move right along then, next candidate to answer this question is Terrence. So let me reset my timer. All right, I'm not really this fastidious. I just have to use my equipment to keep me on time as well. So Terrence, here's the question once again. Over the last 9 years, without a full-time bishop overseeing the diocese, lay leaders of dispossessed congregations have commendably and heroically stepped up to create new missional works. What is your advice to clergy who want to join those congregations in a role of shared leadership? And what is your vision and understanding of a proper balance of lay and clergy leadership in congregations?
Good morning. Thank you for the question. I currently serve at St. Philip's Church in Harlem. When I was interviewed there with the vestry, the warden reminded me that in the last 32 years of their life together, they had only had a rector 12 of those 32 years. In my previous congregation on Long Island, St. Gabriel's Church, I arrived there after they had had a long tenure without a rector, some 12 or 13 years. So the first thing that the advice that I would give clergy going into dispossessed parishes, these churches, is first to say thank you to the leadership there, to thank them for keeping the place going and moving and the ministry happening there. That's what I did at St. Philip's. One thing that is important for clergy to do that I've learned is to respect the culture of the parish. I had a friend who served a parish in South Carolina, and he wanted to teach the parish how to respect iconography and incense. And we know some of the churches in South Carolina, they would prefer to do without incense. And one of the things he said to me is, I'm right on this issue. And I said to him, you can be dead right. Because even though you may be the rector, the people of the parish have a part to play in ministry. The prayer book is very clear. There are laypersons, bishops, priests, and deacons. That's the order of ministers in the church. So the first thing I would do is to remind the lay leadership, as I always do, is that you are ministers of the gospel. And yes, we have different orders in our ministries, some ordained, some lay. But one order is no more important than the other. We have different roles in our vocations and different responsibilities. And so it would be important for me to communicate to the clergy going into these parishes is first to listen, to learn the culture of the parish. And as I was told by my mentors, to leave the place better than you found it. And how do you do that? By working with those in leadership. Now, the role of the clergy, the role of the presbyter, is to equip the saints for ministry. And so that's what I would encourage my clergy to do. Those lay leaders who are already there, that are leading, that are doing great work, we ought to look and see how can we as clergy assist them and empower them in mutual ministry together. Because that's what it's about. Remember, we don't do particular evaluations, but we have a mutual ministry evaluation of the clergy and the vestry. We look at our work together. Also, the church cannot exist without the laity. The laity are important. Their role is important. And so I would encourage clergy to respect the dignity of the parish, respect the culture of the people there first, to listen, to say thank you for what you have done, and to empower them in mutual ministry. Now, how do you have a vision and a balance of that? Well, part of that is education. I think it is important. I think there's some in the church where we may not understand the role of the deacon, the role of the clergy. I think it is important for clergy to teach the congregation their responsibilities and share with them what their role is: sacramental, bury the dead, do weddings, preach the gospel, and then educate the laity in their roles. We do have roles to play, but it is a mutual respect in the ministries that we are called to serve in.
Thank you, Terrence, very much. Next to answer this same question is Callie. So Callie, let me repeat, please. Over the last 9 years, without a full-time bishop overseeing the diocese, lay dispossessed congregations have commendably and heroically stepped up to create new missional works. What is your advice to clergy who want to join those congregations in a role of shared leadership? And what is your vision and understanding of a proper balance of lay and clergy leadership in congregations?
Thank you, Chris, for the question. And I wish I had the questioner, the person who formulated that question, right in front of me, because there seems to me so much that's being unstated in that question, but alluded to, and I think that's a wonderful thing. And let me just say what I'd like to kind of put this in plain language, if I could. To the best of my ability. What I'm hearing in that question is how would you prepare priests going into certain congregations about the strength of the laity that they will encounter? And so what I have said these on occasion over the last 8 or 9 years, depending on one's perspective, the good news and the bad news are the same. The strongest of the strong remained in the Episcopal Church. I happen to think that's the good news. So we have a very strong laity and people who have indeed heroically, as the question writer wrote, have held churches together. And I think that we need to do a better job of equipping our lay leaders across the diocese, particularly in areas, in some rural areas. I'm thinking in specific terms of certain areas, as lay leaders, as possibly lay vicars, and that's one particular model. But I think that it can be a little bit jarring for certain clergy to step into congregations if they do not know what they're getting into. And I think that the bishop has got to be clear, and the bishop is going to have to be actively engaged. Some of these congregations and clergy have been inadvertently, very inadvertently, set up, in my mind, for failure. I think that hands have been tied, And if the bishop is actively involved, particularly when we're looking at mission congregations, and we, for now, at least we have mission congregations in our diocese, and so the bishop appoints, technically the bishop can appoint clergy to those congregations. Well, instead, I think sometimes hands are tied because it's not an interim situation, but there might be a limit, a 2-year limit on a contract. Well, that sets everybody up for failure. Guess what? Everything is going well. And then 6 months before that contract is to run out, the real problems can begin. And so, if that's not set up, if that's not clear on the front end, if the bishop just wants the priest to go there for 2 years, make that clear to everybody on the front end, or don't have such a contract. The bishop, I think, if the bishop is engaged in these matters, and if the bishop knows the clergy in the congregations, then this sort of thing can be alleviated. But it's really damaging, in my view, to the important forward movement that we all need to be doing together, because clergy want strong clergy want strong lay leadership. Because what that's going to do is that's going to propel the congregation into deep growth and further growth and mission and ministry in the community and in the wider world. So there's nothing to be afraid of there, but we need clarity on the front end when clergy are placed in congregations. And again, it's not about the plugging of holes. It's about finding the proper priest for the congregation. Thanks.
Thank you, Callie. All right, Jeffrey, you are next to respond to this question, and let me repeat it, please. Over the last 9 years, without a full-time bishop overseeing the diocese, lay leaders of dispossessed congregations have commendably and heroically stepped up to create new missional works. What is your advice to clergy who want to join those congregations in a role of shared leadership? What is your vision and understanding of a proper balance of lay and clergy leadership in congregations?
Thank you. Yesterday, I found myself giving thanks frequently for whoever had to go first in answering these questions, because it gave me time to think. Today, I'm going to give thanks for people who have to go last, because I'm not sure what else to add to everything that's been said already. With Callie, I was so interested in thinking about what is implied in this question. Like, what is the problem? What is the itch that's getting scratched? What is the challenge? What is the problem? And so I'm having to work with some assumptions there. Second, I'd be very interested in a conversation at some point about the increasing use of contracts in the Episcopal Church and what that pros and cons of that. In terms of giving advice, let's assume that advice is being asked rather than laying out how I perceive what is going on in the particular mission situation that you're talking about. But I'll tell you a story. I had a coaching client who was fairly new in a parish. She'd fairly newly ordained, mature, had come out of a managerial background in retail, and was reading the parish that the congregation that she entered as in ways that were sort of through a lens that wasn't necessarily particularly the culture of the parish. And she was reading strong lay people as people with fiefdoms, and people who were trying to control, and people who were holding on to things. And I asked her, what if that's not what's going on? What if you're talking to people who are passionately committed to the ministries they're caring about? Nobody else is stepping up. They're tired, and they are determined that the poor are going to be cared for, and the sick are going to be visited, and so on. And it turned the congregation. I don't know that it ultimately changed the relationship that was somewhat troubled, but it turned her reading of the parish around. And I think that was, so when Terence talks about reading the congregation, I think that is an incredibly important piece of what's going on. I'm assuming when we're talking about these missions, that we're talking about missions that desire or are shaped to be within this mainstream of the tradition of the Episcopal Church, where the church is ordered for the benefit of the whole ministry of the whole people of God, lay people, bishops, priests, and deacons. But I've also been talking over the last day or so, and in fact months, with you about radically new possibilities of forming Christian community. And I think with such communities, with crowdsourcing and new power and all of those sorts of things, I think that all bets are off in terms of what is the proper role of clergy and laity. I think the whole thing is going to have to change in some profound ways, and we're going to have to live into completely new models. What those will look like is another conversation. So when we're talking about extant missions with people who have heroically and created and hung on. I keep going back to the story of St. Catherine's in the PD, and what an extraordinary story that is. And someone who said, well, we're just stubborn. And I thought, well, call it that. But I think brave, courageous, visionary, forthright, generous, passionate, inclusive are all words that I'd go for first. But I think about what's been going on and how to nurture and encourage that kind of ministry throughout the diocese. When people are tired, give them a break. When people are eager to keep going, get in there and support them. So, I think that's enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much on that first one. I will turn the next question over to my colleague, Larry, and just remind him to unmute himself.
Thank you. Our second question will begin with Kevin, and it concerns congregational vision and purpose. What advice or counsel would you give to a historically African-American church in our diocese that is following a call to be the African-American church in a mostly Caucasian diocese, while also discerning a call to build a welcoming and inviting congregational growth plan? What experiences have you had in working with minority congregations, African American, Asian, as well as race relations and social justice? Kevin.
Yeah, so that's an important question. Thanks. I'm assuming the first half of that question is particular to a real life context, I guess. Here's what I think we have discovered over the last several years, at least in this diocese. I serve on the Race and Peace Justice Commission, and in conversation with African American congregations and African American leaders, not just in the diocese, but also in the community, maybe most importantly in the community, what we have discovered is that as Caucasian folks, white folks, I have a lot to learn. And it strikes me that historical African American congregations could serve as proponents of helping me learn. Not that Black folks are responsible for helping me to learn. I'm responsible for my own learning. But I would certainly, and I think most traditionally white parishes could certainly benefit from being in deep, authentic conversation with historically Black congregations. And in that process, I think there's the potential for real growth for both groups. The real possibility of shared ministry, of shared lives, of shared experiences. And I just think that there's a real potential in that. So I think that's part of the road to inviting growth. In regards to my own experience, I was the founding pastor of a Spanish-speaking congregation that was nested within a historic Anglo congregation. I lived and worked in Central America for 4 years, and am very familiar with the traditions and ethos of Hispanic congregations. And it was a great experience. We are partnered. My particular parish is partnered with a AME church that's right down the road from us, and we do a lot of shared ministry together. The pastor there and I work very well together. We share pulpits. We do outreach work together. We are in a colleague group together, and he and I go to lunch together or grab a cup of coffee about once a month. Partially just because we're friends and we like to spend time with each other. And so, in those conversations, the role of church and the realities of what is still a very segregated Sunday morning comes up, and the implications of that, the benefits of that, the hard parts of that, all those conversations come up. So, really grateful for that. For race relations, that's a big nut to crack. But I think it is something that we are actively working on and moving forward, both as a parish and as a diocese and as a country. In regards to church, race relations are just one of those things that we're going to have to be in conversation with. I have a mixed parish. So Black folks, white folks, Hispanic folks sit in the pews. And what I've discovered is that the key to that is allowing each other to be who we are, as we are, and checking our assumptions about who and how others are at the door. And it's really been beneficial. And listening from the folks who were different than me, listening to them and their realities of the world has certainly changed and benefited me in particular. So, thanks.
Thank you. Is Larry there? I didn't see him.
Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you, Larry.
All right. Jeffrey, moving you more to the middle, I will repeat the question. What advice or counsel would you give to a historically African-American church in our diocese that is following a call to be the African-American church in a mostly Caucasian diocese, while also discerning a call to be a welcoming and inviting congregational growth plan? What experiences have you had in working with minority congregations, African-American, Asian, and Hispanic, as well as race relations and social justice?
5 minutes. Right. Let's fasten our seatbelts on this one. There's a lot to unpack. First off, the church, the African American church that is seeking to be the African American church, I would say keep on doing what you do. As regards being inviting, I'm assuming that presumably means the potential for more integrated sort of congregation, welcoming, changing neighborhoods, whatever you want to, whatever's behind that question. And I think the issues for an African American church welcoming difference is quite different than a Caucasian church welcoming difference, because the power differential is so different. And so I would say find ways to keep being authentically who you are called to be, and by all means welcome people who are drawn to right relationship with God in relationship with you. Specific issues that come up would have to be addressed one at a time. My own experience is limited. When I was a fairly young rector, I was asked to mentor a new rector of a small historically African-American congregation, but I was also friends with a member of that congregation. And so what I heard from the newly ordained and newly installed rector, and what I heard from his parishioner were like two different planets, and that was a challenging thing, figuring out the right questions to ask, and so that he could be more successful. At that same time, I was in relation with a nearby American Baptist congregation, large, much larger, much more educated, much more wealthy than the parish I was serving in Alexandria, Virginia. And we talked about doing something together. And he, and this I think is a tension for, and I'd like to hear from Terence actually, for Episcopal African-American clergy, in terms of, we've just talked about Father Knows Best as being a thing of the past, and I think it is and it should be. But the particular notion of this pastor was that we were going to do some sort of citywide rally, and the pastors were going to be up front and were going to be leading it, and so on. And what he saw as the direction of his congregation, which was not Episcopalian, was just going a completely opposite direction than I was in terms of the role of the laity and so on, in relation to the last question. In terms of I've had Asian parishioners, but I've not worked with a predominantly Asian congregation. I'm in process right now, as I've shared with many of you, of helping St. Albans become one parish who worship and live in two languages by integrating what was a quasi-independent and somewhat struggling small Hispanic congregation that was affiliated with the long history and tricky, but we are now fully integrated, embracing one another, telling stories with one another, and it's raising questions of social justice and class and race and so on. We're doing, as most of us are at this point, sacred ground circles and lots of self-examination of privilege, and trying to become more aware of what's involved in the various dynamics of relationships, and that's spreading out into other parishes and how we relate to others across the diocese and relate to others at work and relate to others at home. It's a really interesting question, one about which I'd like to learn a lot more, and thank you for whoever asked it.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Ruth, I will repeat the question. What advice or counsel would you give to a historically African-American church in our diocese that is following a call to be the African-American church in a mostly Caucasian diocese, while also discerning a call to build a welcoming and inviting congregational growth plan? What experiences have you had in working with minority congregations, as well as race relations and social justice?
Thank you. I agree with Jeffrey. That's a lot for 5 minutes. I want to start with my experience and then move to the earlier part of the question. I had the great gift of being mentored when I was a young priest in Mississippi by some key African-American leaders in the Diocese of Mississippi, most notably Dr. Anita George, who continues to be a mentor of mine to this day, and learned a tremendous amount about what I don't know from her. And then when I moved to Colorado, I was called to St. Thomas, which is a mixed race parish, primarily African-American and Anglo, and again had the gift of some elders in the church who really took me under wing and helped me understand some of the things that I needed to learn to work in that space, and also kind of broadening that out a bit. Had the good grace of a group of pastors in that neighborhood who regularly connected to do work together. And when particularly in around 2015, and I'm thinking particularly of the deaths of Brown and Mike Brown and Tamir Rice and Eric Garner. And for me, the most impactful moment was a moment when my son shared with me the story when the death of Eric Garner happened. And he said, "Have you watched the video?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Watch it." And I said, "I've read the story," and I watched it, and I felt ill. And he said, he just looked at me and said, "Watch it again." You know, and I did. I sat down and watched it again. And in that moment, I recognized that I had a lot more to do and a lot more to learn. And a number of us were feeling that way in our clergy group in the Park Hill neighborhood. And we were a mixed race and a mixed faith group. And we really began to listen and learn from one another and teach one another and determine how we needed to be more engaged in Denver. And out of that group grew really because of a couple of key young leaders, young Black leaders, it grew into the seed that became Black Lives Matter 5280, and which was an unusual chapter because it was in many ways, but particularly because it was for a season, a mixed race chapter. And it had a lot of faith leaders in it. And so we were able to do a tremendous amount of work in the city, both in activism and in our churches. And so I learned from that, you know, this razor's edge piece about not asking of, for we who are white, not to ask of Black leaders, you know, to always carry the burden on top of all the other burdens to educate us, to, you know, to tell us what to do. I really agree with that, you know, that wisdom, that's not necessarily what African-American leaders are called to do or should be asked to do. And at the same time, here we are, right, in the Episcopal Church with such a predominantly white culture in so many spaces. And so the first advice I would give that I've learned out of the experience of the activism in the communities here in Denver is not to African Americans, but to the white leaders. And that advice would be to seek to know what we don't understand, to listen and to learn. I believe we went on to form a race task force in the diocese, and I worked side by side with an African-American lay leader. And I believe that the thriving of African-American churches happens when we are not burdening those churches, saddling them with, you know, it's your job to deal with, you know, centuries of racism and to try to fix or address that. It's your gift to be who you are, to thrive as the church that you are in the context of the diocese, and for we who are white to do the work we must do. I see time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. I'll repeat what you. What advice or counsel would you give to a historically African-American church in our diocese that is following a call to be the African-American church in a mostly Caucasian diocese, while also discerning a call to build a welcoming and inviting congregational growth plan? What experiences have you had in working with minority congregations, as well as race relations and social justice?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. However, I'd like to say that this is not one question. This may be four questions that has been presented to us today. I'll begin. I think we should separate these questions and come back later. And I think we all are dealing with that because we're all going to run out of time. But let me start with the second part first. The second part is, what experiences have you had with working with minority congregations? I've worked with a variety of congregations. And St. Paul's in Bennettsville was the first an all-white congregation, but we know with the trajectory of America, one day St. Paul's will be a minority congregation as we look at the trajectory of how our population is moving. But I currently serve in a historic African American congregation in Harlem. But on not only African American, we're moving to a Black congregation, because in the Episcopal Church, there are very few African American congregations left. There are just not many. And we know that in the Episcopal Church today, many of the congregations that are Black are made up of African, Caribbean, Black people from the diaspora all over the world. I serve that type of congregation in Hollis, Queens. Africans, Yoruba, Igbo. I had people from all the different West Indian countries, and Guyana in South America, Brazil. And so it is a variety of people in these African congregations. My experience also has been with Native Americans in Navajo land. I've had experience working with the Native Americans. I've been on mission trips here with the Diocese of South Carolina. If you remember, we took the medical missions to the Dominican Republic and working with them. So I've served in a variety of contexts and many times have been the minority in the churches that I've served, St. Paul's and the Cathedral of St. John in Albuquerque, New Mexico. But here's where I want to spend most of my time. That is on the first part of this question, or I would say the first question in a four-part question or four questions. What advice or counsel would you give to historically African-American congregation in this diocese, in a mostly Caucasian diocese, while discerning the call? Well, one thing that an African-American minister, prominent minister in the United States, said about the Black church: the Black church is not the Black church because we wanted to be. It's because we had to be. If we look at the history of America, my children and I, we just took a trip to Philadelphia. For the first time, we left the state of New York, and we went to St. Thomas, the first African American Episcopal congregation, just for them to see it. And then we went to St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church, the church where Absalom Jones and Richard Allen were pulled out of their seats because they were told they could not pray, and they were moving the Black folks up into the galleries. So we're the Black church because we've had to be the Black church. Now, what advice would I give to that congregation? Yes, the congregation is to keep doing what you are doing, to be the church, and to not apologize for being the Black church. You're the Black church and you have survived. Now, here's the thing that I'd like to say about the diocese and the diocesan structure, and really in the full context of the Episcopal Church. This question takes us to what are we doing to support African American congregations? When I graduated seminary in the Diocese of South Carolina, I was sent to St. Paul's in Bennettsville. I was the first African American to come through the diocese since 1962. And I went to seminary in 2002. So for 40 years, we didn't raise up any Black clergy from South Carolina. So there's a lot I could say about this question. But what I want to say is the advice is to keep on doing what you're doing. However, St. Philip's, where I serve, we came out of Trinity Wall Street. We were full members of Trinity Wall Street. And one of the things I'm working with my church to realize is that we built Trinity Wall Street. And Trinity Wall Street has billions of dollars. And St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Harlem needs funds. We could use some of the billions that Trinity Wall Street has. And if you look at the history, we were full-fledged members of that church. So one of the things we've got to do in the Episcopal Church is really take a look at the disparities in income and in the wealth of some churches that have made that wealth off the backs of Black people in America. That's the reality, and that's the real issue here with this question. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to answer.
Thank you, Terrence. And Callie. What advice or counsel would you give to a historically African-American church in our diocese that is following a call to be the African-American church in a mostly Caucasian diocese? A welcoming, inviting congregational growth plan. What experiences have you had in working with minority congregations, as well as race relations and social justice?
Thank you, Larry. And again, this question intrigues me in that it's multi-pronged, but also the line in there about the as I read it, that is the church that is following a call to be the African American church in a mostly Caucasian diocese. That question, that intrigues me, that definite article, the. And the bishop of a diocese is to promote unity. So if the bishop is sitting around, and I think this would be something very important for the bishop to do, because this has not happened in many, many years, but the bishop needs to gather the leadership of the historically African American congregations together in the diocese to have a conversation, to listen. If that question were to come up in such a setting, I wonder what the other, we have more than one African American church, so that is a little, it's a little curious to me what that means, and so I think that but with regard to being an African American church within the diocese, obviously the advice that I would give is be who you are, and how can I help you to do that? We've got to begin in more intentional ways resourcing all our congregations, and in particular our African American congregations. Most of the African American congregations in the diocese chose to remain in the Episcopal Church, chose to remain in our diocese. And so it was very easy in the early years of the reorganization efforts. It was very easy, I think, for diocesan leadership. Everyone had his or her hands full with simply reorganizing, and all the remnant congregations. And so the African American congregations were by and large neglected and left to languish. That's a sin, and it's a sin that we as a diocese are guilty of, and it needs to be remedied. So how would we resource them? I think too, telling the stories of the Black saints of our diocese. Our wider diocese does not know the stories of the Black saints of our diocese, those who have moved on to glory, and those who are still living among us today. It's an incredible witness and an incredible education for the rest of our diocese. I'm not going to talk about all my experiences right now. I'll just let you read about those, because I don't think it's necessary to take the time right now to go through my experiences in these matters. But we have, suffice it to say, that we all have a lot to learn, particularly white people, and we have a long way to go. And if we see ourselves as on this pilgrimage, then that means it's a pilgrimage of learning and inner reflection and amendment of life when it comes to the treatment of our African American congregations. Thanks.
Thank you, Callie, and thank you all for a very difficult question. At this point, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we will reconvene at 11:10. You may cut your feeds if you like. Thank you.
I'm going to step away for just a moment. It looks like people are beginning to come back. I'm going to step away, but don't worry, I'll be right back. Well, it looks like all of our candidates are back, and I would imagine then it's now time to resume. We are now up to our third question, and Callie will be first this time. And this question is a great deal shorter than the last one. And as I can tell, it only has 2 nettles in it, if you could call them nettles. Here we go. Are you ready, Callie?
Yes.
Callie, can you offer examples of ways you have taken your faith into the public square? And if elected, what do you see as the bishop's role in matters of social justice?
Thank you. Yes, as the vicar and subdean at Grace Church Cathedral, the cathedral really does see its role as a cathedral church. It's located in the very center of the city of Charleston. If you take a photograph, you know how if you do that, it'll tell you, your iPhone will tell you where you are, and it says center of the city. And so geographically, that is where Grace Church Cathedral is located. And so a large part of my ministry, particularly over these last few years, has been to be active in the community. And part of that has been hosting, I talked about it earlier, but hosting regular okra soup suppers. In the early days when we began those suppers, we had members of the Charleston City Police Force joining us, and members of the wider community. And we would listen to speakers and then have guided conversation around tables. And that's something that we've had to pause naturally owing to the pandemic. But that's just one example. Here lately, I've been serving on a diversity commission that's just been started at Middleton Place. And as you know, we see these articles in the New York Times all the time about how these plantations have recognized the need to deal with, to examine their past and to promote a way forward. And so that's a new venture for Middleton Place, and I'm pleased to be a part of that. I just recently was able to connect. I had the privilege of serving on the board at Voorhees College, and I was privileged recently to connect the interim president of Voorhees College with the CEO of Middleton Place. Middleton Place is 60 miles south on Highway 61 from Voorhees in Denmark, South Carolina, where I think you are right now, Larry. But there are ways in which they're going to be able to partner, be it internships or all sorts of things. But these are being involved in the community is just something that comes very naturally to me. And I do see it as a part of my current ministry. It's a natural place. And in terms of being on those front lines with matters of justice, that's where we are, and that's who we are as members of the Episcopal Church. That's a natural place for us to be. And so those being involved in such areas and avenues is a very, very natural fit for me. I could go on with other examples, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Callie, thank you very much. Next up to bat is Ruth. And same question, of course, let me repeat it. Can you offer examples of ways you have taken your faith into the public square? If elected, what do you see as the bishop's role in matters of social justice?
Great, thank you. The other day, maybe a month ago, I was cleaning out a drawer at our house, and I found a newspaper clipping of myself as a young priest. We were looking at it, reminiscing. It would be one of the first times I had the occasion to take my faith into the public square. I was standing on the steps of the Capitol in Jackson, Mississippi, lobbying for adoption rights for lesbian and gay parents who, were being denied those very basic rights. And that is still under attack, as we know. I began at an early age to appreciate the gift of taking faith into the public square, and particularly when our clergy and our bishops do that. I shared the story at the beginning of these conversations of Bishop Gray Jr. in Mississippi, who really was the first icon for me of what it means to put oneself at risk in order to offer that witness. I have continued to understand that as a central part of my role here in Denver. And in the last answer, I had the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work we did at St. Thomas and later in the diocese. I have had opportunity to be in marches and in protests fairly often here, actions in the street. And also I've worked extensively with our Latinx and Latino ministries. And we've had a couple of very important immigration cases. One with a clergy person here in Colorado who was at risk of his family being really ripped apart, and they have a beautiful young daughter, and they were terrified of this. And we were able to direct resources from the diocese to provide legal counsel for him and his wife. And I was the primary point person with our attorneys in working on that case, and was also able to appear in court. I've appeared in court more than once, and think that's extremely important to bear witness and testimony in court in such cases. So those are some examples of what I have done as a clergy person. And I, as your bishop, if I were called to be, would absolutely understand my role, including to stand with you in the public square, to speak to issues of justice for people who are experiencing the oppression, the pain, the terror sometimes that is caused by our collective acts of injustice. I'm very committed to this. I understand this to be work of a lifetime and work in which it is our duty to put ourselves on the line. Christ has taught us this, and it really comes out of our understanding that we are one body, and that the outworking of sin is really separation. And all of the oppression that we see and the sins that separate us really reflect our brokenness and our need to heal that. And there can be no reconciliation without, I didn't see if that was 1 minute or time, Larry. Was that was, well, I'll keep going for just a second. 1 minute. Okay, great. Excuse me. Our work toward reconciliation, which I think is the core gift of Christ, has to include justice. So for a bishop to refrain from being stirring up the conscience of the people, as the examination of the bishop calls us to, is to neglect a very key part of the role of bishop. And I do not think that that role is in conflict with the bishop being the chief pastor of the people. I believe that those are of a piece, and that what is good justice is good pastoral work. And good pastoral work includes standing for justice. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. Next up is Kevin to answer the same question. Please let me repeat it. Kevin, can you offer examples of ways you have taken your faith into the public square? If elected, what do you see as the bishop's role in matters of social justice?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm going to answer it backwards. Start with part two, then go to part one. So I've worn a uniform my whole working life. First in the military for a long time as an Army officer, and now as a priest of the church. And what I've discovered is that in those roles, when I am publicly acting in those roles, I represent everybody in the organization, not just myself, and even people beyond my particular organization, because that's what outsiders see. And so I am very aware that every action, every public action as the leader of an organization affects all of us. And so that every act has to be considered. Given that, the core of the biblical story is biblical justice. And so I don't think that if we're going to be honest and authentic to Scripture and to the way of Christ, I can ignore biblical justice. And so in considered acts, what I've discovered is if I stick to the principles and ethos of Jesus of Nazareth, then I'm usually pretty safe. And sometimes sticking to those principles and those ethos requires the courage to be present and speak out loud. So I've done that historically. I think the biggest part where I started this was with Moral Mondays in North Carolina, starting, I guess, about 10 or 12 years ago. And in this diocese, in most recent times, at the diocesan level, we had a very serious, significant, extended conversation about at what level should the diocese be publicly present in standing up and speaking up for biblical justice in our culture. And we chose to do that. We considered it and we chose to do that, knowing that it affects all of us, even folks who may be uncomfortable with that or disagree with that. So we created a very public website called godlovesall.info. We sponsor a sponsored agent in the Tarrant County Pride Parade and Festival, and show up with a float sponsored by the diocese and signs from the diocese, and the clergy are all in clergy attire, and the people all have signs. And I think year before last, there wasn't one last year because of COVID, we had 75 people show up and march together as a diocese. In my parish, in ecumenical work with this, we developed an entity called the Inclusive Faith Coalition, which partners with other churches that are truly open and affirming. And frankly, we are a lobbyist organization for the city and school districts in regards to biblical justice for LGBTQ folks. And we also ecumenically have sponsored citywide prayer gatherings for immigrant children on multiple occasions, working across the board, not just with other denominations, but also with other nonprofit organizations. Because in the end, standing up for biblical justice is important and critical. And so we have discovered that, and we have made those choices. I've made those choices. I've been part of those conversations. And sometimes, well, I've gotten hate mail. But if it saves one child's life, if it keeps one teenager from committing suicide because they think that they are completely wrong and broken and unsavable, then the hate mail is worth it. So, thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, next one to answer, please, is Jeffrey. And I will repeat the question for you. Can you offer examples of ways you have taken your faith into the public square? If elected, what do you see as the bishop's role in matters of social justice?
Yes, I shared with one of the groups last night that I prefer there to be some level of consensus in the community, not totally unlike what Kevin's just been saying, some level of consensus in the community where when I take my faith into the public square as an official, that would be that a rector or a bishop, that it is coming out of something that the community has sought to address. So in Atlanta, where I served for 18 years, we had 4 core ministries. One was an addiction recovery house. One was clothing children with dignity. One was extensive ministry with refugees, and one was ministry with the working poor in Midtown Atlanta. And those were our core ministries. And we decided that we could speak to those issues, refugees, immigration, race, addiction, working poor, poverty, etc., and did so. And so I would, join others in lobbying both the state legislature and the city council when there were issues before us. As a personal matter, insofar as it has been distinguishable, I have tended to join any activity that has to do with gun control, and then that's come about since I buried a young man who was caught in crossfire in Washington, D.C. And I joined his parents and other parishioners and friends lobbying whenever possible. I've also, in Georgia, spent a lot of time with a lot of other clergy keeping vigil outside prisons where prisoners were being executed, as a personal commitment, but also as part of a community commitment of the church. So I would see the role of a bishop very similarly. That is, but the question is, how do we come to some kind of understanding of social justice that is not just knee-jerk to every single issue that comes across the table, and is clearly a scriptural call to hospitality, compassion, widows, orphans, and the poor, the weak, the lame, the helpless, etc., etc., etc. I shared that I prefer to talk about racial justice than racial reconciliation, and I think eventually we're going to need to talk about reparations, probably as a diocese. And I realize that's very scary for a lot of people, but the question will be, how do we come to that measure of consensus that will allow the bishop to speak, and the bishop will have a role in shaping that consensus. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Terrence, you get to go last on this question. So here it is again. Can you offer examples of ways you have taken your faith into the public square? If elected, what do you see as the bishop's role in matters of social justice?
Thank you. A few years ago, I was on an airplane actually by myself, and I sat next to a Caucasian couple. And I was actually traveling, I was in my clericals, and the gentleman asked me, he said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I'm an Episcopal minister. And we began to talk. And then finally he said, we're Jewish. And we began to talk about race in America. And he said, the difference is that when you walk into a room, you are a Black man. People see you clearly that you're Black. There have been times as a Jewish man, I've been in a situation where there have been jokes about Jews made because people didn't realize that I was Jewish. I tell that story to say that I cannot separate my faith from my politics. I've tried to do that. And I know that we try to do it in the church often. I know that in the predominant church, that's something that we do. But as an African American, my faith is tied up in the politics because it's who I am, and I am a product of this American experience. And so I can't separate that. But what I want to be clear about is that the bishop is a public theologian going into the public square. That is important. I'm very clear on that. If elected, what do you see your roles as the bishop's role in matters of social justice? Well, I think that the bishop should be the public theologian. Right now, the AME bishop is in Atlanta speaking out for voter rights. I think that this time that we're living in is causing the church to have to be prophetic. We have to stand up on the side of right. Now, why can I say that so confidently to you, South Carolina? Because you did it. You, the people of South Carolina, decided that you would not go with a church that is unwelcoming, that says only these particular types of persons can lead our church and be a part of the leadership here. Well, you can come and you're welcome, but you can't be leaders. Well, you said no to that. And you said that everybody is welcome. LGBTQIA+ members of this church are welcome. And so that's what I believe the role of the bishop is. Now, yeah, I believe that we should come together as a diocese. I should receive advice from the leadership and the clergy. I will never just walk and stand out making public statements on my own. But I am also clear. This is one of the things I want to be clear about. You all are electing a bishop to be a leader. And one of the things I learned from Edwin Friedman in his book, A Failure of Nerve, Leadership in the Age of the Quick Fix. Matter of fact, I first encountered that book with Bishop Salmon. We did a study with him. And Edwin Friedman says this, he reminds that if you're a good leader, you ought to be a self-differentiated leader. That's who I am. I want to be a non-anxious presence to you. And I believe I can be a good pastor, but also a public theologian and speak to the issues of social justice. I believe that the church, Dr. King, who's my hero, wrote a letter from the Birmingham jail. Remember that letter? We had to read it in seminary. And he wrote that letter not to the politicians. That letter was written, you all remember, it was written to clergy. And one of the clergies it was written to was the Episcopal Bishop of Alabama at the time, telling the clergy that now is the time to do what is right. So I think days are over where we can sit back and let the others do and speak out. And we are calling the universe, the Holy Spirit is causing us to become and be prophetic. Now, how have I done that? Well, I serve at St. Philip's Church in Harlem. So I've been on the front. I'm a part of the oldest African-American fraternity in America. That's Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. We are about advocating and providing service in our communities. So I'm out on the front lines as a part of that fraternity, as a priest in the Episcopal Church, as the rector of St. Philip's Church for voter rights, preaching a prophetic word. My associate, Chloe Breyer, is the director of the Interfaith Center. We've had the Interfaith Forum at St. Philip's Church. We've spoken out against the brutality, police brutality against George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. St. Philip's has been on the forefront in its 211-year history. We've also been on the forefront not only of social justice, but also of mental health. St. Philip's Church was the first Black church in America to have a mental health clinic. So it is who I am in my DNA. And it's because I have to be. But also it's because the church ought to be on the side of justice. Finally, I will say, James Cone is also my hero. And James Cone reminds us that we ought to be on the side, and God is on the side of the oppressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Terrence. And thank you to all of you candidates who gave the answers to this question. I'm going to turn things over to Larry now for the next question.
Question number 4, and we will start with Jeffrey, not picking on you, of course. Which theologian has most informed your theological framework and why? Which of their works have impacted you most deeply and consistently, and why?
I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Dietrich Bonhoeffer and read everything, but the clear sort of heart, in a sense, of his work is The Cost of Discipleship. And that has been something I've reread and something that has been a recurring influence throughout my ministry, particularly around issues of cheap and costly grace. That said, the sort of neo-Orthodox tradition out of which he comes doesn't always speak to the full doctrine of incarnation and embodiment that I seek. In recent years, I would say that, and so therefore more current, absolutely fundamental. In fact, with Bonhoeffer, I'm actually serving as the chair of a pastors committee of the International Pastors Committee of something called the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute, which is a whole interesting story based here in Washington. But in recent years, I have become much more entranced with the work of René Girard, who is a French cultural critic out of Stanford, who had a number of theological interpreters, one of whom was a man called James Allison. And James Allison is a Girardian who has helped me understand both the process. It's very, very actually dovetails very well with the work of Edwin Friedman, and triangulation and creating scapegoats, and has helped me understand some things that I didn't really understand before about why Jesus was put to death, and how the tensions led to people trying to deal with their own anxiety by finding a scapegoat and murdering Jesus on the cross. I'm trying to think what book I would recommend. James Allison has a number of collections of essays, any of which would be quite accessible. His bigger books are not immediately graspable. René Girard, Things Unseen Since the Beginning of the Earth is one I would turn to. I read broadly in theology. Jesus and the Victory of God has been another touchstone by N.T. Wright. I'd be happy to talk about any of them further, as you wish, or any other theologian for that matter. But I would say for now I'd go with Girardian theology, even though he was not a theologian, and the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Thank you, Terrence. Jeffrey. Terrence, I will repeat the question for you. Which theologian has most informed your theological framework and why? Which of their works has impacted you more deeply and consistently, and why?
This is an interesting question. I compare it to like asking which child is your favorite child. There's so many theologians. There's so many theologians that have impacted my life. I will take some liberty and talk about a couple. First, James Cone, I just mentioned in my last answer. James Cone really saved me in seminary. As an African-American studying the theologians at Nashotah House, the theologians we studied were all white. And so I went to my systematics professor and I said, are there any Black people writing about theology? And he said to me, you ought to read James Cone. James Cone, who was the professor of systematics at Union Theological Seminary, wrote most recently, the book that has impacted my life is The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And what he does in that book is he challenges the liberal Protestant theologians of the early 20th century to remind them that in their writings, they never addressed the lynching of Blacks in America and Christians, those Blacks who were Christians. And so what he reminds us is he compares that book and the lynchings of African Americans to the crucifixion of Christ. If you think about that, there's the Negro spiritual. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Lord, were you there when they hanged him on a tree? And so that was an important point for me. But also he wrote a theology of Black liberation, which just helped me to understand that God is bigger than what we can even imagine. And that stretches all of us. Think about the images of God as a woman, that you women who are on this platform, the images of God that you received when you were young. You know, God was what? The old man with the big long beard, in the cave. But God is bigger than that. God is so much bigger. But also another theologian that I have to mention that Jeffrey mentioned, N.T. Wright, my hero. Oh my God, I read all of, well, that's not true. I haven't read all of what, because N.T. Wright is a prolific writer. But I've read a lot of what he has written. And my favorite book is Surprised by Hope. I've taught it in the congregations that I've served. Rethinking Heaven, the Resurrection, and the Mission of the Church. That book changed my understanding of Christianity. Why? Because we tend to think and even preach that, we're going to do all that we can until we get to heaven. We'll go to church and we'll live right and we'll do everything. And when we get to heaven, that is our great reward. And N.T. Wright turns that upside down. And he reminds us that we ought to be bringing heaven to earth. Think about that. That's the way the rethinking is. We ought to be ushering heaven in right now. So N.T. Wright is one of my heroes. He's God, prolific writer, probably the premier theologian, at least in my eyes, in New Testament today. And then finally, a theologian that is one of my favorites who has really impacted my life is that theologian, Michael Curry. Michael Curry. In his most recent book, Love is the Way. I studied that most recently with my congregation and the congregation of Christ Church United Methodist. And in that book, Michael Curry reminds us that during these troubling times, love is what's going to, and we talk about love, and I know the world thinks, oh, that's a weak word, but love is what is going to transform the people. And we, the church, ought to be the experts on love. So these theologians have impacted me in different ways. James Cone, because he spoke to who I am as an African American, just as Fiorenza would speak to a woman who's doing theology, and N.T. Wright, who speaks to my New Testament leanings about heaven and hope and why we do what we do as Christians, and then my bishop, our bishop, who talks about love. These are the theologians today that I have been impacted by. And I can name a few more, but I think I'm out of time.
Thank you, Terrence. Callie, which theologian has most informed your theological framework and why? And which of their works has impacted you most deeply and consistently, and why?
Well, I'll just echo that in book study about 4 or 5 years ago, we read The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone, and it changed my life. My whole understanding. I remember preaching about it on Good Friday. I've not ever been the same since reading that book. And in terms of the theologian that walks with me, I would say that would be there are many, but the William Temple really speaks to my soul. And William Temple, of course, was Archbishop of Canterbury from 1942 to 1944. During World War II, he died while he was Archbishop. But prior to that point, he had written a number of books and was on the radio. And while he was Archbishop, he was on the radio. And so I'm thinking about The Church Looks Forward. The Christian Society Today, and Religious Experience is another one. But he has lots of essays and sermons, and his addresses have been published. But he was the one who famously said that the church is the only organization that exists for those who are not yet members. I discovered him. Actually, my grandparents had one of his books on their bookshelf, so the name to me was familiar. But I only learned about him when I got to seminary at Sewanee. And of course, things in the Diocese of South Carolina in those days were really of one flavor. And so Temple, as I said, spoke to my soul because he dealt a lot with simple human nature. Who we are as people of faith. He addresses issues of selfishness. I remember he said one time, we human beings are selfish folk. And when we are tired, we're more selfish than ever. Just very, very plain language. But he talked about how the church cannot thrive when it exists with only like-minded Christians in the body. So if a diocese has only like-minded people, the church is not going to flourish. And we need the experience of the other. He talked about how our demeanor, he used the word temper, our temper in meetings, in gatherings, ought to be more of learners rather than champions. We might be able to win the argument, but do we need to? Do we really need to? Maybe we actually have something to learn. You spoke about the readings in St. John's Gospel, of course, is just a classic and a delight. That the Word of God is living, it is personal, it is Jesus Christ. And that was, of course, when I was only hearing that the word was the written word. That was what we were hearing. And so, in knowing that God was much broader than we were being led to believe in our diocese at that time. And so it was just such a breath of freshness, but it was also a return to my own roots as an Anglican Christian, a part of the Catholicity that I knew existed. The memory I had of my grandmother saying to me, just because we have the word Protestant in the name of the Episcopal Church, we are Catholic. And again, that whole sense that we are part of this worldwide, not only communion, but this worldwide church. Thank you.
Thank you, Callie. Kevin, repeat for you. Which theologian has most informed your theological framework and why? And which of their works has impacted you most deeply and consistently, and why?
Thanks. So, really, for my whole priestly journey, I've carried around a phrase written by an Eastern Orthodox theologian, Alexander Schmemann, which says, all of our existence is included in the all-embracing vision of life. All of our existence is included in the all-embracing vision of life. And that vision of life is the fullness of life for everyone. That's really what's driven me. It's driven, I think I could draw a through line from every sermon to that phrase. And every pastoral conversation, every time I'm standing at somebody's bedside at the hospital, every time I sit down and pray. So I carried that around with me for many, many years, and most recently discovered a theologian. I guess he's been around for a long time. He's still alive, Richard Rohr, who has argued for the concept of non-dualism. So much of us in the Christian world, certainly in the Western Christian world, have grown up with the concept that God is out there somewhere floating around and we're down here and there's a gap. That just didn't seem right to me, and it certainly didn't fit in with my experience of all of our existence is included in the all-embracing vision of life. Because life itself is the creator. And so we are all bound up in that. Non-dualism has given me a way to think about the concept and to know the idea, the reality that I know of it, which is that there is no place where God is not. There is no place where God is not. God is both on the cross, on the desperateness of the cross, and God is in the joy of the resurrection. And however that plays out in each of our individual lives and in our corporate lives. I've discovered that in very practical ways. I think in my little 3-minute blurb, I talked about standing on the steps of the parish in which I was confirmed as an Episcopalian and not being welcome to receive communion on those steps anymore. And that broke my heart. God was in that desperate moment. So there is no place where God is not. In regards to text by Richard Rohr, I think the Divine Dance, I think, is the name of the text, but it's his exploration of the Trinity and the idea of the mutuality of dance, of shared dance, which is the metaphor, of course, that we try to explain what it is to be all giving, all generous, all thoughtful of others, while at the same time being willing to receive the gifts of others. That mutuality of dance. So I think if you need to pick apart my theology, that's the core of it, and that's what drives everything that really I do, and how I live, and how I engage with others, that I hope to engage with others. So thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. And Ruth, repeat for you. Which theologian has most informed your theological framework and why? Which of their works has impacted you most deeply and consistently and why?
First and foremost, Julian of Norwich. When I was a seminarian, one of the things I wrestled with was this whole question about salvation and universal salvation. And, it's a question that you can proof text all the way around in the scriptures. And I really struggle with that. And I had a professor, Julia Gata, who taught us the mystics. And she really introduced me to Julian. And I took that copy of Revelations of Divine Love, and it is marked up at least as heavily as my Bible. And it has been, I would say, just a primary text with me through my whole ministry. I am a person who's very image driven. Images really compel me. And boy, the images in the Revelations of Divine Love are just stunning. Going down to the bottom of the seabed, and Jesus being our clothing, which for love enwraps us. And of course, the phrase, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well, which calls to mind all of the things we carry every day in this world. But her primary, the central piece that has so guided me is this concept I mentioned earlier about God wanting us. God, in Christ, God one-ed us to himself. She speaks to God calling us back into the oneness for which we were created. So that, I think, that text has really guided me in every dimension of my priestly ministry, in pastoral work and justice work, in the work of leadership and guidance. Ronald Rolheiser has also been a very important theologian to me, and the book of his that's been most important is The Holy Longing, particularly because it speaks about how we are to be the body of Christ. And he talks at one point about the passage in the resurrection story and when Jesus and Peter are on the beach, right after the best known part where, the three, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Right after that, there's a part we don't often pay quite as much attention to. Jesus says to Peter, when you're young, you will gird yourself and go where you'd like. But when you're older, someone else will gird you and take you places you do not wish to go. And Ronald Rolheiser talks about that passage in terms of our being conscripted, the conscription of the body of Christ, being pulled by Christ, places that we otherwise would never go. That is the theology of the cross. And that is our greatest challenge, but also our greatest joy is when we are conscripted in that way, because that's where we find our purpose. So I have returned again and again to Rolheiser, and quite honestly, specifically to those few pages in that book, because I think it really expresses how we are to live amid our differences as the body of Christ. I have also been impacted by some of the theologians you all have named, my colleagues have named, Kohn and René Girard, especially as Pastor Paul Neutralin has interpreted him. I've recently begun working with Aubrey Hendrick's work around, and particularly in light of our current political divides. I found his new book on the politics of Jesus to be very compelling to me in contrasting what we're hearing in rhetoric where Christianity is often co-opted for a kind of triumphalist, privileged approach to really understanding what the politics of Jesus were, which, as we know, were quite different than what we're seeing in that narrative today. And Aubrey Hendricks really is compelling me with how he is articulating that. So those are some of the theologians that have and are informing my ministry. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. And I will thank all of you and turn it back to Chris.
All right. Thank you, Larry, very much. And thank you again, candidates, for being here and for giving us your thoughts on these things. So now I want to turn it back over to Pat and to Rick.
Okay, we want to thank everyone who participated today in the morning panel discussion. I know that I learned a lot listening to all of our great candidates, and I hope that everybody who was able to tune in was also. We're going to move now to noonday prayer, and after that, there will be an extended afternoon break. Please plan to log back into Zoom using the same link you used this morning before 5 p.m. That is when we will begin evening prayer. Again, if you have any technical questions whatsoever, you can address those to the diocesan staff members. Noonday prayers today are being led by the Church of the Messiah in Myrtle Beach and also by the Episcopal Church in Okatee. Thank you.